Okay, so as we were saying, one of the things we wanted to do with this conference was to kind of meld together or bring together so many different aspects of Italian-American culture, Italian-American life. And part of that, as we've been talking about Xavier, St. Francis Cabrini, and Scalabrinians and Servites, was to just talk about the experience of being an Italian-American vocation, and how much maybe the Italian-American sensibility played into that. And so we've asked three priests who were Chicago-born, or at least probably Chicago-born, to give a little bit of their experience. I want to make sure. Give a little bit of their experience of how these two things came together. I've asked each of them to talk for about 15 minutes. Then we'll allow for a little bit of conversation as well. Okay? Again, I think we're going to start with Sure.
Buonasera a tutti. If that's good enough for Pope Francis, it's good enough for us. My name is Father John Belmonte. I'm a Jesuit priest. I am very happy to be part of this sort of joke with a Jesuit, an Augustinian, and a diocesan priest. But thankfully we didn't go into a bar.
Still time.
Maybe that'll happen later.
There you go.
It is a delight to be with you. As I mentioned, I'm a Jesuit priest. I was born in Chicago to an Italian-American family, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Joined the Jesuits. I am presently the superintendent of Catholic schools in the Joliet Diocese. So I live out in Joliet and then kind of travel around the diocese supervising the schools. I help at Our Lady of Pompeii, so it's good to see some people from Pompeii, and I'll talk about that in a second. What I'd like to do is take you to a couple masses that I have said, and sort of start there and then work my way back to here. So the first Mass that I would like to talk about, I said on June 29th, 1996. And then the second Mass that I'd like to talk about, I said on, let's see, I said on August 8th, 2010. Okay, and I want to kind of work back through both of those. The first Mass takes us to Chialamberto, Italy. And Chialamberto is a very small town in the Provincia di Torino, so north of Turin, about 10 kilometers from the border with France, in what's called Valle di Lanzo. And that is basically a forgotten valley in between Val d'Aosta, which is very famous, and Val Susa, which would be well known by Italians living there because it's a vacation hotspot. And so in this forgotten corner of Italy, where probably even Hannibal himself passed by, you find the beautiful Alpine mountains. You can find in the summer terrific and beautiful flowers, a lot of sunshine. You can find vacationers up in Chialamberto. And in the winter, you find snow and cold, and then you find more snow, and on top of that, some more cold in the winter. There are about 350 people who live in Chialamberto, including my cousins. Antonio, who just died last January, his wife Caterina, their children Angelo and Laura, Angelo's wife Silvana and their children, and then other cousins like Maria, Modestino, and her family. My first cousin was Angela Chiariglione, who I got to meet when I was there, and her sons are Aldo and Vittorio. Aldo is someone who's distinguished himself as a mountaineer and an outdoorsman. He was the curator of the local nature museum, and this summer he was a candidate for consigliere to the Sindaco, to the mayor of Chialamberto. And so that's a little bit of the scene and the context, and what this is the third Mass that I said as a priest, I said in the church in this small town. Because after my ordination here in the States, I went back to Italy to go to some first Masses of friends, and then went to this small town where my great-grandmother was born, and I said Mass there in the 500-year-old church, which which is the church of Giacomo e Filippo, the apostles. And what it did was, on top of concluding what, at least genealogically, would be a 274-year odyssey that I was able to uncover, it also marked my first miracle as a priest. And I suppose this can go into my hagiography or something. But anyway, after this mass in this small town, in this 500-year-old church, one of the women in the village who I became friends with, who was just a great person, came up to me and she said, "Complimenti, padre. You have, on your first miracle as a priest, you want to give you my compliments." And I said, "Oh, my first miracle as a priest, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you were able to perform your first miracle as a priest as a result of this first mass." And I said, "Madalena, what do you mean first miracle?" And she said, "Well, your cousin Antonio was at mass, and that's the first time I've ever seen him at mass. And so, in my book, that counts as a miracle." Well, when I told my cousin Antonio about that, he didn't think that was very funny. In fact, he had kind of an interesting spiritual life himself. He didn't actually go to Sunday Mass, so I got him to go to Sunday Mass, or his wife probably did. But he would go exclusively to funerals in that town, which meant that he went more than once to Mass during the week because there was a lot of elderly people, and so he, out of devotion and respect to the dead, he went to all those funeral masses, and so, God bless him. Now, he didn't go to Sunday Mass, so we know, of course, that's mortal sin, and he should be going to Sunday Mass, but nevertheless. And so I had done genealogical research in this town and discovered my fifth great-grandfather, Pietro Gagliardi, was baptized in the church where I had the privilege to say Mass in 1722. I wasn't able to go all the way back to 1586, which was where the parish registers finished, because the parish priest there was rather grumpy and wouldn't allow me to look at the registers more than a couple days, and so I had to interrupt my research. But what I discovered was my bisnonna, Paulina, was born and baptized in that town and in that church, and she was the first one really to ever leave the Valle di Lanzo. She left with her sister. They went to the upper peninsula of Michigan in a town called Negaunee, where they joined with other northern Italians as iron miners, and she was a seamstress. My cousins who were there and still live there found it hard to believe that I would come back to find them, because it took me 3 trains and 1 bus ride and then a 20-minute walk into the town to get there. And frankly, my cousin Antonio didn't even like to leave the town, so the idea that my bisnonna would leave more than 100 years before and that I would come back and find them and actually say Mass in their church was astounding to them, but it was well worth it. And so what I'd say is the faith that I found there, which becomes part of my vocation story, was a simple faith, but what was decidedly Catholic. I met and became friends with a great priest named Don Biagio Lozero, who was 87 years old. He would march around the town in his cassock. He would drive his miniature Fiat 500, where he was a menace to all on the roads. And he gave me his 50th anniversary card from his ordination as a gift, as a sign of friendship, and it's something that I've kept in my breviary ever since. And so I got to know these people. I participated in the parish festival in this town, and I went to the mountains to visit the shrines, and one of the most famous shrine in the area is in a place called Forno Alpigrai. Again, would be just on the border with France. I ascended the 444 stairs that the pilgrims, out of their own devotion and penance, would ascend on their knees. I decided to go on my feet instead, because I'm a wimpy Jesuit instead of tough like them mountain people. And this sanctuary was something that was founded in 1629 and was part of an apparition of the Blessed Mother to someone named Pietro Garino, and then what became a place of pilgrimage and sanctuary for the entire area. I mention only because for those of us who have been back to Italy and have done these sorts of researches and so forth, we know the just incredible wealth of of faith and richness that's part of that country and part of our heritage. And it truly is overwhelming just mentioning this kind of sliver of faith that I was able to recover, in a sense, for myself and for my family, that it just kind of goes on and on. And so I'm sure all of you could add your own stories of faith that comes from your hometowns and from your family, which is truly humbling. And so you have my Bisnona Paulina, who actually was married twice. Something a bit scandalous for the beginning of the 20th century. Her husband died of the influenza in 1914, and then she remarried, and she actually left her husband because he did not treat her well. And for that, she stepped outside of the Catholic Church for a while, still raised the children in the Catholic Church, which is why I stand before you today as a priest. But she was a seamstress. They made enough money, moved down to Chicago, and she gave my grandmother, my nonna, the name Lucia, because she was born on, hard to guess, December 13th, right? And they spent time at Assumption Church, and then eventually, when my grandmother married my grandfather, they moved to the Basilica of Our Lady of Sorrows. And so that's a bit of one side of the family. Just to share with you, the other side has to do with August 8th, 2010, when I had the privilege of saying Mass out in Stone Park, or as we say in Calabria, Stone Parque. Been to Calabria, right? Stone Parque. So my friend Joe Bruno, who's going to speak tomorrow, and we'll talk about the Società di San Francesco di Paola, he asked me to say Mass at the Festa della Famiglia. Some of you may have had the joy of attending that. It's a great Mass with about 2,000 people, and then all kinds of sorpressata that you eat afterwards. And that, for me, is the conclusion of another odyssey that it has to do with my bisnonno, Agostino. Now, he was named Agostino because he was born on the 15th of August, which of course is the Feast of the Assumption. And so the connection back to my faith, our faith, is also to remember when people remembered the liturgical calendar and then honored the saints and the Blessed Mother by names given to them out of the liturgical calendar, which I think is important. So he was born in Rende, provincia di Cosenza. And so my family brings together, as I like to say, the knee and the boot of Italy. And so he left Calabria in about 1890 with his brother Antonio. They lived on Forker Street for a while, which is now really probably just the Dan Ryan over there. He married a Napolitana named Auriemma, a decision from which my family has never recovered, of course. So you have this Calabrese marrying a Napolitana, which of course is a mixed marriage, as we know. And then they gave birth to my nonno, Giuseppe Carlo, who was an altar boy at Notre Dame Parish here on the west side. And so what a nice Italian boy was doing, serving Mass at a French church, is something that I've never been able to understand even to this day. But he evidently liked blondes, and so he went to the Italian community up in near Superior Street, and he found my grandmother, who of course is the northern side, and she was blonde. And they married, and eventually, as I said, moved to Our Lady of Sorrows, where my father was born. My father then married my mother and moved out to the suburbs, only after, he likes to tell, making sure that there was a beef stand within a 2-mile radius of on the Calabrese side, I visited Calabria many times and have really come to appreciate the beauty of the faith there as well. I did genealogical research, and it's worth noting, different from my genealogical research in northern Italy, the genealogical research in Calabria, I will say, required me to lie, cheat, in a certain sense, steal, in order to get the information I needed. What I found there was a beautiful faith in southern Italy. I met incredible priests, some of whom are friends of mine to this day, and people who I respect and admire. Padre Pino Stancari is a Jesuit who's in Calabria, who has an incredible mission there. I got to know Don Raimondo Verducci, who was the parish priest in a town called San Lucido, who I became friends with. I visited the Santuario di San Francesco di Paola, the great place of the sanctuary of St. Francis of Paola. And all of these things were for me a reminder of the history of the gospel and the importance of the history of the gospel for Italy, certainly, and the people who brought the gospel there first, the gospel that all of us read and have been converted by, but also the history of the gospel in Chicago and how the gospel was brought really by a Jesuit, by Father Marquette, just a little propaganda here, over at 26 in Damon. And so, and how that gospel has come to us through our grandparents, great-grandparents, or great-great-great-grandparents. And so I just simply say, in terms of vocation and vocation story, offer you this one biblical passage, which I find quite simple and beautiful, and that is from Mark 3:14, where it says, "He appointed 12 that they might be with him." He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach. And that I would simply offer to you as the most simple and eloquent definition we have for our Christian faith, that we are called to be with him, that he might send us out to preach, it says, according to the apostolic tradition. And so, in a certain sense, my family, my bisnonni, all these people that have gone before me in the faith, these two sacred places, these places that I hold sacred in my own vocation story, are ways of being with Christ in his people and his sacraments and his word. And so my vocation story itself is, I would say, pretty ordinary, in some ways kind of boring, so I'm more interested in talking about my grandparents and my great-grandparents, because I lived a pretty simple parish life out in suburban Chicago, Our Lady of the Wayside. My faith was awakened in college, in some classes at Marquette University. I admired the Jesuits there, and so I decided to join the Jesuits. In a moment of weakness, they allowed me to enter the order. I've dedicated my life to education and to teaching young people about Christ, so that they might have an experience of Christ. And that simply really is it. The other part that I would add to this vocation story, which is a beautiful gift to me from my family and also from the church, is the service that I've been able to render to the Italian community here in Chicago and also in Milwaukee. I have been, for the last 12 years, I've been able to say Mass at Our Lady of Pompeii on the west side to connect to my family and also to serve the Italian community there, to the American community there. I've been chaplain to the Società di Santissimo Crocifisso, a group of Sicilians here in town. I've also helped out with the Società di Beato Giovanni Liccio, another group of Sicilians, Santa Fara, another group of Sicilians. I've said weddings and masses and funerals and all sorts of different anniversaries and everything for Italians and Italian Americans here in Chicago and in Milwaukee, where I was working. And for all of that, for me, has been a beautiful experience of the call that Christ gives to each one of us to be with him. And so my story of Italian faith, of Italian American faith, is really simply that. And for that, I'm most grateful to my family who have shared the faith with me, and then also to the church and God's people who have allowed me to serve in this way. So those would be my remarks, and I'll leave the microphone to someone else. Thank you very much.
I think we would ask Father Dominic Grassi, the pastor of St. Gertrude, if he'll go next. That would be very good diocesan priest and sandwiched in between the two religious orders. So.
Good evening. It's good to be with you tonight and celebrate wonderful heritage. Somebody once said they took blood from me at the hospital and there was tomato sauce in the DNA. So, my story starts in 1941. I wasn't born until 1947. 1941, my sister, who was in kindergarten at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, not Melrose Park, but Belmont and Broadway, we'll get to that in a moment, came home and announced to my mom, as my mom was on her knees scrubbing the bathtub, that she wanted to be a nun. And my mom lifted her eyes to heaven and said, "Please, Lord, don't take my daughter." 6 years later, my sister died of polio and those terrible epidemics. And to her dying day, my mother thought she was being punished by God. added to that thought of being punished by God was I was born 10 months after my sister died. I was the replacement child. And it was going to be my job to fill that particular gap. I was the fourth son after my sister. All four of my brothers and I went to the seminary. They asked us in high school seminary. By the time I got to it, it was quickly north. It was also quickly south. My oldest brother said I was only going there because I wanted to be like him, and bet me $25 I would never make it to ordination. In my closing comments at my first Mass, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, I made him pay up. It was kind of preordained, I guess, that I was going to be ordained. My mother also tells the story. I was born at Columbus Hospital. My mother, in her simple peasant way, wanted no medication, nothing to dull the pain. She wanted to be there for my birth. And at one particular point, she let out a bit of a scream, to which one of the wonderful sisters said to her, "Shut up, you had your fun, give this one to the Lord." My life has been, therefore, an incredible struggle between the peasant faith of my parents and the theology I learned in the seminary, and somehow trying to bring them together. I'm still working on it after 41 years of priesthood. My dad was born in a small farming village called Correggio, right down the hill from the village of Alberobello in the province of Bari in Italy, where the beautiful Trulli home. My mom was born in the Trulli right next door to the church. In Alberobello, my dad was born on a Trulli on a farm right down the hill. Blessed to have been in both of those places, and families still living in both of those places even today. It was a beautiful part of the world, but my dad's grandfather and his great-grandfather both outlived their first wives, and so married again and had two sets of children, and the family farm kept getting subdivided until there wasn't enough for my dad and his brothers. So they left their lands to the youngest, my Uncle Mike, and they came to the United States after a little side trip to do some fighting in North Africa. They came and they ended up doing work in the coal mines in Pennsylvania when a chunk of coal fell on my dad and knocked out his two front teeth. He made me promise that when he died, I'd make sure the gold teeth were still in his mouth when we put him in the ground. They wandered to southern Illinois and then up to Chicago. They opened a few corner grocery stores. In the year I was born in 1947, they opened up the fourth largest grocery store on the north side of Chicago, a couple blocks north of Wrigley Field. Don't call it a fruit stand. That's what I would hear from my teachers at the seminary all the time. It wasn't. Actually, for guys who had no education, they were brilliant. Before Peapod, you could call in, and they had a girl that would take orders and fill the orders. And we had delivery trucks that would take you to the homes. And I once asked if I could take the ride because there was one house on Sheridan Road that every 2 weeks ordered $50 worth of food in a case of Cutty Sark. I just wanted to see who those people were. It's kind of interesting. If you know the people from Bari, when somebody says you're from Bari, it goes test of the And I think that's really true, and it speaks a lot about the faith of the people. The land was hard, living was hard, even when they came to this country it was hard, and the hard-headedness made them very successful. So I made it through the seminary. Somehow my brothers didn't. They went on, got married, had their families, are into great-grandchildren now. I do have a grandnephew named Dominic. My niece said, Dominic, if he was the first, we never would have had any more. So there's something in the name, and again, preordained. Dominic Grassi, the fat one belonging to the Lord. What's the translation of that? Every village, every town in Italy, you go through the was a sign of honor. It meant you had enough money to have meat on your bones, or a thyroid problem, one or the other. And so it was all in the cards for me to become a priest, I guess. I think a lot of it came from working in the family grocery store. We all had to work. That was preordained, no pun intended. We started when we were about 10 or 11 or 12 years old. We started fronting the cans on the shelf. It was one of the first self-service grocery stores in the city with carts. People didn't know how to use them. They had to be taught on how to put food in the cart and make choices for themselves. And then after that, you became a bagger. And after a bagger, you became, you worked in the produce department. And then after that, you were sent away for a weekend to the National Cash Register School on Michigan Avenue and learned how to ring the cash register. I came in fastest, second fastest and most accurate, because I could figure out if there were 6 oranges for 49 cents, how much, if somebody brought 5 up, how much you charged them. Dollar each. I've been privileged to go back to Arabella for the feast day a number of times. Patrons of the hometown of Arabella, the Santa Medici, Cosmos Dania, the healers, the doctors, and you know, they're not even from Italy. They're on the other side, they're east. And so a good chance that there is some Iranian blood flowing through us here. We can't trace it back as far as we would like, but that there is some of that there. But they were interesting saints to me. My mom would regale me in all the stories, all the legends. And there was the good brother and the bad brother. And the good brother was Damien. He was gentle, he was kind. Cosmas was the mean one. He was he just, you know, he was kind of mean for a saint. The story goes, when they went up to heaven, St. Peter said, I only got room for one of you on my list. And so, and they said, which one? And he said, Cosmas. So Cosmas said, okay, I'm coming. And then he pushed Damien ahead of him and walked in. You know, you take care of your own is part of that message there, because you love them so very, very much. And that was very, very important to all of us. And so as I watched my dad and my uncles run the grocery store, you just start to absorb things. About 3 blocks away on Clark Street, there was a large, very large laundry, one of those almost factory-like laundries. People would leave their clothes to be picked up in the alleys and the bags, and they'd be washed and sent back home. And most of the employees there were African-American. And they would come to the store on Friday night after getting their paychecks on Friday and shop. And some of the white customers didn't like that. They didn't want to see those people in the store. And I remember one of them confronting my father. And my dad looked at him very gently and said, you know, money isn't white, it isn't black, it's green. Very pragmatic. And after the customer left threatening to boycott the store, my dad did something very simple. There used to be a 50-cent check cash and charge. He dropped it for all the African-American customers. Didn't say anything to anybody. That was his way of dealing with things. There always was a sense of justice that grew out of that very peasant faith that was theirs. One of the very first Festa Italianas that took place, one of the very first, my mom got into the papers because of it. Because she got absolutely, totally berserk upset because she went past the dunk tank that they had set up. And they had a sign on it, Dunk the Melon John. Oh. And my mother said, you low-class people, you're making us all look bad. She took the sign down and tore it up. And there was a reporter from the Sun-Times, took her aside and said, was that a pejorative comment? And my mom said, it means eggplant, what do you think? I was so proud of that little gal. She only stood about this tall. I was 21 before I realized she wasn't 6 feet tall. And it was all a very simple faith that was there. It was something that was part of our lives. The calendars every year that came from Italy, from the hometown. The monies that would be sent so family could carry the statues on the feast of Cosmas and Damien through the village. My grandmother, Nona, taking me to Columbus Hospital almost every month, to the chapel, to the shrine there, and saying a prayer to this day, with the parents gone, we still sit around the table after the pasta is gone for hours telling the stories. And when you tell the stories, the layers come off, don't they? I found a little booklet once. It was Sayings from My Grandmother in Italian. And I read one of them to my mom. And the saying that I read to her translated into English, I'm the one chopping the onion and you're the one crying. And she smiled, and it was maybe a year or two later, we're all sitting around the table, and that story came up. She said, now I'm going to tell you what the real saying was. They cleaned up the book, she said. This is the real saying. And it's the one that stayed with me now my whole life. She translated it a little bit different. The way she translated was, I'm the one laying the egg, and you're the one complaining you have a sore ass. Isn't it great? Our job is not to complain. Our job is to love. Boy, I found a way that I've been able to do it for over 40 years, and I'm blessed. And every day I thank my mom and my dad in my prayers for all that they've shared with me and the faith they share with me.
So we go back to the religious orders.
Good evening. I want to thank Mark and Dominic for the invitation to be up here with my colleagues. It's a pleasure. My name is Tony Pizzo, and I'm a native Chicagoan. I actually grew up in the South Coast side, just west of Midway Airport. I am of both Sicilian and Neapolitan extract. My mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, are just outside of Naples, and my father's parents are just outside of Palermo. As a matter of fact, my last name, Pizzo, which is a Sicilian name, is a Sicilian colloquialism for extortion. Real conduit. I just wanted to make mention a little anecdote here for Colin. He gave a wonderful presentation on the Greenie. You are looking at a walking, talking, fifth-class relic. Yeah. My maternal grandparents were friends with Mother Cabrini when she was involved in the construction over there of the Columbus Extension Hospital, which later became Mother Cabrini. My grandparents lived over on Racine and Lexington. There was a 12th flat there where the whole family shared for several years before they actually lost the building, and would run into her periodically and thought that she was truly a saintly woman. On the other hand, my paternal grandfather, whose wife, my grandmother, she was a very sickly lady and was constantly in and out of the hospital. On one occasion, he wanted to stay beyond the visiting hours. Cabrini was the administrator. After the nurse would come in and ask Mr. Pizzo to please leave, he refused. He was very much of a Galados Sicilian. In the meantime, Cabrini came up and threw him out. He never forgave her. And wondered, how is it possible that the church could canonize una strega? I feel somewhat schizophrenic.
Took your college and taken your
You know what? Yeah, right. Yeah, right. My earliest recollections as a child, especially with the practice of faith in the home, was actually with my maternal grandparents. They were really very religious people, although my grandmother was a very emotionally charged Napolitana. My grandfather, on the other hand, was a very calm, collected individual. In his later years, he was a stroke victim. What I recall is he'd be sitting in the parlor most of the day, and he'd be mumbling. What he was doing is he was praying his rosary, pretty much the whole time. When my grandmother would be running around, helping my mom with us 5 kids and so forth and so on, he'd be there simply praying. She'd come into the parlor, she'd smack him upside the head and ask him why he couldn't do anything. And he would have his hearing aid turned off. What I remember of all of this was his calmness and his religiosity. We also did some interesting folk practices in the house, which I thought were pretty normal and common. And that is, when us kids would be sick, meaning the grandkids, my grandmother would do something strange with an egg. To this day, I'm not exactly sure what it was. Then she would take olive oil, and she would spread olive oil over the area that was affected, whether it be a cough, let's say a headache, stub or toe, whatever the case was. These kinds of things I remembered very well. It wasn't until later on that I realized this was culturally specific in our lives. As a matter of fact, when we moved from Sacramento and Flournoy, Mother Cabrini Parish there, to where my family still exists at this particular point, that particular area of the city right now is still somewhat Polish, very, very few Italians, and a lot of Irish. The parish I grew up in, and the school I went to was founded by an Irish pastor. The associate was Irish. The IHM nuns were Irish. We had to wear light green shirts, dark green pants, dark green tie. The walls were green. The blackboards were not black, they were green. So I grew up with a lot of this Irish propaganda and paraphernalia that helped to kind of, let's say, give me a different kind of a perspective on what it means to be other than Irish. Other than Irish. And for us, it was really important that we celebrated our Italianness in my family. We had a lot of the traditions that had already been mentioned. Christmas Eve, fish dinner only. The gathering of everybody at all the holidays. My mom and dad's home, my father would always say, was like Grand Central Station, even though he was not from New York. But he would always say, we always have a house full. Thank God and God bless. My mother would always be concerned about not having enough pasta when she cooked for an army. There was always enough food. My father was not an every Sunday church goer, but religion and faith was important for him. As I got a little bit older, and maybe a little bit wiser, although I wasn't, maybe I was too much of a wise guy, I did ask my mom, how come Daddy doesn't go to church, but you make us go to church? She smacked me upside the head, and she says, you don't question. It wasn't until after I decided to enter the seminary that my father became a very devoted, practicing Catholic. Pretty common, I guess. But in the meantime, you know, as we grew up in our particular religious culture, we learned to really appreciate what we received along the way. After I had entered into formation, seminary formation, it was required of us to make a yearly retreat. And so I decided to make it up at the Jesuit Retreat Center in Bellarmine. Bellarmine Center, I believe it is. Yeah, I thought it was a Catholic retreat. But anyway. Something interesting happened. I had no idea of what a retreat was about. I just had to do one. Okay? This was over the course of the summer. And the Jesuit who was there at the time, who I think is now deceased, was assigned to me as my spiritual director for those several days. So he said, Tony, what did you want to do at this time? I says, you know, Father, I really don't know. Give me an idea. He says, what if we were to explore the origins of your vocation? Yeah, sure. Why not? As us priest types know, that's probably one of the most frequented asked questions, right? What made you become a priest? You know, what prompted you? You know, what motivated you? So I thought, all right, this might work. I always thought it was because, as I was going through grade school, some of my best friends talked about becoming priests. None of them did. I did. But in the meantime, what we explored was my family of origin. And what we were able to pinpoint was my grandfather, the very one I just told you would be the calm, peaceful guy, always praying. Didn't say a lot. Why would that have been so impressive for me? Why would I somehow wind up with having this deep, emotional, and even spiritual connection with my grandfather, who died when I was 9 years old, but who I remember being a very loving and dedicated man to the family. And perhaps that's what it was. So I was really delighted when I realized it was really my grandfather. I'd like to think, I'd like to imagine that perhaps he never articulated this, but maybe he prayed that I would be a priest. And maybe that was a desire and a wish that we had. So that for me was very powerful as I, reflect back on my life. I was ordained in 1984 by Cardinal Bernardine. This coming May, I'll finish 30 years as a priest. And I still reflect, going all the way back, on the origins of why I am who I am and why I do what I do. Now granted, there are many factors that have contributed to all of this. If somebody were to say, why would you even stay as a priest? I think Dominic just mentioned it. Because I love the church. Because it's the people of God. Because I'm fed and I'm nourished. In some circles, we call that mission in reverse, where the more we give, really, the more we are given. And that's how God works. So I thank God for my vocation both as a priest and as an Augustinian Catholic. Big kidding. So I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my story with all of you. And all of us, I know that us religious, us priests, we have all kinds of circumstances that lead up to a decision that bring us to the point of our profession, our lifestyle, our commitment. But it all boils down to one thing. It's about God loving us and us wanting to love back. Thank you.
Some questions? I'm one of those young boys who thought I had the calling, and then when I defined celibacy, I knew I couldn't go through with it, even at a young age before I had any experiences. But when we used to ask the nuns, because we were all very, very much involved, family prayer, rosaries, very, very strong Catholics. I would go to the sisters and I would say, how do we know if we have the vocation? And she said, the Lord will tell you. And I wondered, did you have those kinds of moments when you were young that sent you to the seminary? Or, was it pure pressure of other friends who went on? To me it seemed like a very, because I kept listening. I said, Lord, you want me to be a priest? You tell me. And maybe that was the wrong way of going about it. Maybe that's why I ended up a professor. Dominican. Dominican train. From Puglia. That's the last.
I'm still listening. People of God, it's every day. You're ordained every day. You're ordained not once by a bishop. You're ordained every day by the people of God. And some days it comes a little bit easier than others, but it really is that kind of thing. There never was a voice. There never was anything like that. It's just something, we had great priests early in Mount Carmel. People like Gene Foucher and just wonderful priests that were real role models for me and in the seminary, and that really helped too. Today it's just the people of God keep calling.
I'm a little younger than my two brother priests up here. My experience of the church was post-Vatican II. I would say that my experience of catechesis was quite weak. We had, John Denver songs and frankly even streakers running through the church on one Sunday afternoon, believe it or not, in the suburbs here in Chicago. And so I didn't have as much Catholic culture as Father Dominic and Father Tony described. And so it wasn't really until, I mean, my family was religious. My father was actually quite religious, more religious than my mother. And so I had, I think, a pretty solid Catholic upbringing. I didn't go to Catholic school, despite the fact that I'm now superintendent of Catholic schools in the Joliet Diocese. Did CCD, made all the collages, all the stuff that we did in the 70s. And it took, you know, it took until I got to college and started taking theology classes and going to Mass on a regular basis at school to have my faith awakened in a more serious way. And that's when I connected what I would say is a call to service in the church. And as Dominic said, that call comes every day, and you respond every day. And God, you know, the bishop said at my ordination was, today the church gives you permission to become a priest, or to try to become a priest. And that's something that we have to try to renew every day. So that's how I describe it.
Brent, I appreciate the question. It still remains a mystery, you know, on some particular level. I don't use that as an excuse. But I look at it this way, that every morning I get up to face a morning Mass, and even though I may have a schedule in the parish, you just don't know what's going to go on. And you almost have to consciously make a commitment in the morning again. I will do what I will do best, you know, as a priest. And God help me that I always keep my focus in doing this. There is no voice, you know. There is interior stuff going on. But why are some called and some not? We don't know. Only God knows. So we just have to let go and trust that that which we are called to, and we do well at it, and continue to learn about, is all part of what I consider to be God's grace.
I am the fourth priest of here, so I'm going to say a little bit, and ordained much more recently. I would just say this: it's not so much a voice, but I call it the vocation as a double negative. I reached the point where I said I could not do this. And it really came as two negatives. It's like, because I was living in New York City, I was having a great time. I didn't really think, you know, why should I give up this great time? And so there was a real sense of a kind of a push back, but I could not do it. And I think that's how I would really respond to the way, you know, it always becomes a positive, right? And that is that sense of the morning. It's like, you know, I cannot not do this. This is really, it's at a deeper level. But I do think that I would agree. I grew up with Kumbaya as kind of our Eucharistic song, and our opening song, and our closing song, and it was just one of those things. And it wasn't really until I went to a Catholic high school that had a pretty good theology, but it was college for me to do it. So anyway, another question.
Listening to your stories, you're very young. Most of the Italians in Chicago have been ministered to by all over in the 20th century by priests who were taken to the seminary when they were in the 8th grade or something, and they went to the Sacred Heart Seminary in Stone Park, and went through the various years there, and the whole idea was to create a seminary, taking Italian-American boys and turning them into Italian-American priests to serve the Italian community. And that was a much different experience, I think, than I mean, you all went to college or something, or after high school went to the seminary, but they started early.
It's a very different world in some ways. Any other questions or comments?
One other thing that has to be said is the importance of family and vocations. La Familia is really, really important. And if we're looking at some of the causes of perhaps the decline in vocations, it is a lot of families would not want to see this as part of their children's lives. It's just the reality that is there. The night before I was ordained, and it was up at Mundelein, and my family lived on the north side, there was a knock on my door at the seminary. My 3 brothers showed up. They were going to take me out and teach me how to drink a little bit of wine at a time. They were the only 3 guys the next day at the ordination that were hungover. But they were there for me, and that meant so much to me. That they would make that trip, go back home, and make it back with my parents the next day. The family is so important, and the whole concept of what family means is, if you mentioned celibacy, one of the great things is to be around the table, the altar, and be a part of that family. That makes such a difference, such a blessing, such a grace.
I just like to make one final comment, and that is, we're talking a lot about the past, we're in the future, in the present, but also, I think some consideration should be given to the future. I'm very grateful to Father Mark for putting something like this together, because my own experience is really of more sort of recovery and living into my Catholic family background. Having lived and studied in Italy, having gotten to know my cousins generations after we left and everything, for me it's been a lot of recovery, and there's tremendous, tremendous power in that. Power of the faith, power of the faith of the people, power of the faith of people in Italy today. And so I just wonder out loud, where does that take us into the next generation of young Italian Americans here in Chicago, and then what is going to be their experience of the church and of our faith going forth in the future. And I think opportunities like this are really moments for us to consider that, so that we can, on the one hand, preserve what has been so beautiful and so helpful to us, but also be sure to share that with the next generation, so that they can be moved and touched and brought to Christ just as we have been.
My final comment would be, we're talking about faith and culture, and things can get so diluted for succeeding generations in our respective families, and I see that happening even in my own. But one of the things that's really interesting was after I spent my first assignment in the Detroit Archdiocese in a parish that had a number of Sicilians, they all sniffed me out because I was the first priest with a Sicilian surname, so I felt very much at home there. In Kenosha, with all the Calabresi up there, and I had to win them over, but I got them. And then coming back to Chicago, however, I got involved in Hispanic ministry. And one of the things that is fascinating that I have found in working and living with the Mexican community are the similarities. Faith, family, relationships, that's right. All of this, these are the priorities, these are the values. And it's like I live the nostalgia of my past with my loving grandparents and my parents, and all the beautiful traditions that we had, both secular and religious. And I find so many similarities, not the same, but there are similarities, and that continues to feed me. And that's my comfort zone, even though there could be a lot of challenges.
Thank you very much. I want you to know that Dominic and I did try to canvass if it was an Italian-American nun, and we didn't maybe either have enough time, or we could not find one who was at least working or living here. Maybe if we had more time to do that. But so I was hoping that we would have also that experience, that anecdote. So what we did is we gathered people that we could that we knew. So yes, Tony, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just as a quick question. I'm old enough when I was an altar boy and I was held the patent, knew that I was not to touch the host, that if it fell, I was to protect it. The priest received it. Later, lay people, including my father, began to give Holy Communion, administer the sacraments. Can I ask about the role of lay people within the ministry? And can I ask a question about women in the ministry? Because my sense, and I know I won't be a huge...
I think you can answer that. You can ask that when we're having champagne. Or I think the answers will actually be more interesting after the second. Definitely, let's talk about that. that note, we do want to celebrate a very wonderful day, a very intense day in many ways. I just really thank you so much for being part of this. And we continue tomorrow, as you now know, at 9 o'clock with the Scalabrini story with Dominic. He promises he's going to get a lot of espresso coffee and be ready for that. And then we have a full day really of Italian-American cultural production. So we were going to talk a little bit about literature and art and some of the kind of different ways in which that's been produced and talked about within, especially in Chicago or in the Midwest. So please join us for them. But now we want to turn it over quickly. Actually, do you want to do it back there after?
Let's do it.
Do it. You should do it here. So Gloria and Dominic, this is a kind of book launch. And Anna Clara.
All the people from the book. There's a lot of people from the book. Fred, Mary Jo, Vincenzo. Have I forgotten? Anna Clara. Is that everybody here?
Come on, Mary.
Come on, Mary Jo.
Totally.
Oh, yes. Do we have everybody?
Yeah, I want to introduce Gloria Nardini, who was co-editor with me on the, I couldn't do it alone, obviously. It's a book about Italian-American women, so they have a guy be the editor. So I found Gloria to protect me, and she's done a fantastic job, and she'll conduct a little explanation of the book.
Our third editor is not here. She's Kathy Catron-Bone, but she has a cousin who is here. Kathy Catron-Bone has 50 cousins spread out throughout Chicago. Speaking of Save Our Stories, this is our new book, and this is part of the reason for the Prosecco reception. It's called Italian Women in Chicago, Madonna Mia Qui Devo Vivere. And it's a compendium of assorted things. There's a first section that's a historical section that Dominic curated that talks about Mother Cabrini, Florence Scala, Mary Tina de Rosa, all kinds of Chicago women whose stories are known and not particularly known. Then there's a second section that we're calling the literary section that I curated that has memoirs, poetry, stories, etc. And it all creates a portrait of what has happened to Italian first women and then Italian American women from the start of their immigration to Chicago to right now. Anna Clara, would you like to talk about something that you wrote?
I don't even know if I belong to the group, but somehow I did end up in the group. And my story is a little different, kind of. I mean, my grandparents immigrated to New York, and my grandfather was 16, it was 1911. They stayed there until 1958. My mom was born in New York, but then they went back to Italy. So then I came here. So on the reverse, right? And I came here, and I was a lecturer sent by the Italian government. Dr. Silvio Marchetti was my director. I was the first Italian lecturer to come to Chicago, and I was assigned to teach at Northwestern and here at Loyola. I was supposed to be here 3 years and go back to Italy. This is now 26 years ago.
Just briefly, I talk about Rosa Casatari, the work that I spoke about early this afternoon. And I talk about what it's like teaching it. It's a very teachable book, and the students love it. And I so terribly want to take it off my syllabus, and then every year the students say, you can't take it off the syllabus. It means so much to us. Make sure the next group that you teach gets it. That's it.
And I talk about the untalkable, the mother. I talk about my mother after I went through therapy. And she says, well, I like that you're getting help, but don't tell them anything about the family. My mother was an incredible woman of faith. I'm sure she converted more people, I mean, than just about anybody. She actually left the Catholic Church and joined the Christian Assembly, but never stopped ministering her whole life. When she died, we found throughout the house little prayer slips for everybody. But she used to, we talked earlier today about guilt and shame and so on. She had a mother who committed suicide. She had a father, a father-in-law, and a husband who were murdered. And yet she raised 4 kids. And we get to the point, and a lot of the way she kept us sane, or maybe we weren't sane, was by lying to us. And she took those lies with her to her death. And so this is the story that I wrote about, that is what happens when you find out that the woman you learn truth from is full of lies.
I wrote about my mother. She was a seamstress. She came in the States to follow my father, and she wanted to be with him. So she left a very nice job in Italy so that she could live with my family. And she worked at Art Shelton and Marx. And I wrote all about what her experiences have been in the United States. That's all.
You're in the book, right?
In the book,
Get over
yeah.
there.
You gotta come up, yeah.
You gotta say, right.
Yeah, I'm Lou Corsino, and I had a little piece in the book about gendered spaces. I grew up in the same community that Dominic grew in Chicago Heights, and I talk about gendered spaces as, well, first, even before I start, let me say one thing. Having been here today, I come away today being a little bit smarter than I did when I started, a little bit more Catholic and a little bit more Italian. So I think that was all a very nice... one of the things that I did about gender spaces was that all the great stories about women and Mother Cabrini are wonderful, but there's a dark side I wrote a little bit about, that Italian women weren't allowed to be in public spaces. Their place was in the home. So I write a little bit about how Italian women were excluded from places outside the home in Chicago Heights. And as a result of that, lived lives that were maybe not as full and not as rich as they could have been. As rich as they were within the home, they were denied in some ways opportunities. And maybe the question maybe you asked, I think the church was a gendered space. And the closer you got, I can be respectful here, but the closer you got to the altar, the more women were, when it was a sacred place, the less women had opportunities to participate in those types of activities. And that's just one example of, I do a little bit on analysis of those types of things.
They could hear the altar at Rosary.
Tony, you have to come up too. Pam? These are all people who are in the book.
Yes,
Yes.
No.
Hi, I'm Pam DeFilio, and I wrote about Tina DeRosa in the book. And Tina was a Chicago woman who actually went to Wonderland College right next door here. And she was a gifted fiction writer. She wrote one great book called Paper Fish. It was a story about a true Chicago story, kind of about her own life growing up on Taylor Street. And her dad was a Chicago cop in the book. And just her adventures as an 8-year-old girl growing up in this Italian-American family. And Tina, unfortunately, left us. She died of cancer at age 62 a few years ago. And Fred was a mentor for Tina and a good friend. And so look at Tina.
Thank you. Tony?
I was surprised to be in the book because when I first read about it, what's the title?
Italian women.
Italian women in Chicago, I did think that my work was eligible. But then Dominic said, no, there are some men whose work can be included. The collection has one of my short stories called Nona, which is about an elderly woman. I lived on Taylor Street for 2 years. After I finished college, I came back to Chicago to work. And she's childless, and she wanders the streets, confused because the neighborhood's changed, because Daley has ruined it, because Circle was built. Florence La Scala is mentioned, is referred to not by name, but the woman who came to the door. And it's about the neighborhood and the change of the neighborhood. And she ends up in a Mexican bakery buying flatbread.
We also have Ann Rubino wrote something.
Yes, Ann.
Ann's not here, but we can have her husband or her daughter speak to the story. It's your mother that she writes about.
Well, this is in regarding to my mother. My wife is not Italian, she's half Swedish and half Irish. And so what she wrote about was the relationship between my wife and my mother. And my mother was not an easy woman to deal with. She made life miserable for me as well as for my wife. So you have to read the book to appreciate it.
Okay. And then we would have,
And then we're going to sell these books. All of them. In essence, we are talking about inventing an identity. My Italian-American mother did this. She kept the books for my father's business, dealt with the CPA who did the taxes, sent out and paid all the bills, made out weekly checks for all the help, took care of all the daily banking, went in on Fridays to the restaurant, it was a restaurant, to take cash. I can't remember when she ever did these things. She was always at home when I came back from school. She never talked about it much, and she called herself a housewife. Today, we would call her a financial advisor who works from home. I have a lot of them. $25, we'll all sign them for you, and Dom is going to collect the money.
all right, so let's go back to the back. Thank you very much, and we'll celebrate with some Prosecco and some hors d'oeuvres as well.
Thank you.
Wow.